Welcome back to Countryside Sagas, wishing you a peaceful day with open sky and steady ground beneath your feet. Now, let's walk together into today's countryside tale.
347. That number took Walt Messner 3 years to earn. Not 3 years of trying and failing. 3 years of adjusting feeder height by half-inch increments. Of tracking average daily gain on 30 ear-tagged hogs every single week. Not because the lender required it, but because the data was the only honest account of whether what he was doing was actually working. Of switching soybean meal suppliers twice when the protein analysis came back inconsistent. Of running the same ration formulation through 4 consecutive production cycles until the variation between cycles was small enough that the number meant something. Feed conversion ratio. 47 pounds of feed to gain 1 pound of hog. In a finishing operation running 580 head in 1985, that number was the difference between an operation that worked and one that looked like it worked. He'd been proud of it in a quiet way, the kind of pride you don't say out loud, because the moment you say it out loud is usually the moment something goes wrong. Something went wrong on a Wednesday in late January. I know this story because I lived inside the same system, not Walt's system. I didn't run hogs. I grew corn and soybeans on 320 acres, about 40 miles from where Walt was operating. But Tri-State wasn't just a name, it was a category. Every county in the Midwest had one. A cooperative or a mill or a supply arrangement that small and mid-size operations had built their whole logistics around. In 1985, I received a letter too. Different letterhead, different language, same shape. I read it at my own kitchen table and then read it again. I'm telling Walt's story because it's accurate, and because the people who are building operations right now are sitting on the same assumptions we had in January of that year. The letter from the Tri-State Feed Cooperative came in a standard business envelope, cooperative letterhead, 2 paragraphs. The language was careful. Operational restructuring. Transition to alternative supply relationships. Final deliveries by February 14th. Walt read it at the kitchen table. He read it again. Then he did what he always did when something important happened. He walked out to the bins. The pre-mixed finishing ration, Tri-State's corn-soy blend, formulated for his hog stage and adjusted twice at his request over the previous 3 years, sat in the number 2 bin. He opened the inspection port and looked inside. His best estimate, 12 days. Maybe 14 if he pulled back slightly on feeder settings and accepted some drop in intake. 12 days. The Tri-State Cooperative had been running since 1961. It had survived drought years and price crashes, and at least 2 rounds of consolidation in the regional milling industry. It had not survived 1984's credit contraction. The agricultural lender that carried the cooperative's operating line had been watching a portfolio full of distressed farm loans, and the cooperative, an agricultural borrower in an agricultural credit crisis, had the wrong profile at the wrong moment. The board had voted in December. Walt was finding out in January. He had 580 finishing hogs. They consumed approximately 3,900 pounds of mixed feed per day. And in 12 days, the supply chain that had been feeding them was going to stop. The first call he made was not to another feed dealer. It was to Loretta Strand at the county extension office. Loretta had been the agricultural agent for 11 years. She was not the kind of person who said don't worry when there was reason to worry. When Walt explained the situation, feed supply gone in 2 weeks, 580 head on a continuous flow finishing schedule, 19,000 bushels of his own corn in storage, but nothing else. She didn't tell him it would be fine. She asked him for his current FCR. 347. He heard her write it down. That's your baseline, she said. We're going to move away from it. The question is, how far? She explained what he already partially understood but needed to hear precisely. A self-formulated finishing ration built on farm-ground corn would run lower digestibility than commercial premix, primarily due to particle size variation. The target for finishing swine was 600 to 700 microns, mean particle size. Commercial mills hit that consistently. Farm-ground corn, unless run through industrial equipment, came out coarser and more variable. Coarser grind meant more feed passing through the gut before full energy extraction. FCR climbs, a DG drops. Not catastrophically in most cases, but the number moves. How much? Walt asked. Depends on the grinder. If you get access to something purpose-built, you might hold within 0.15 to 0.20 of your baseline. If you're running a small PTO hammer mill, could be 0.30, 0.35. That changes the math considerably. She asked one more question before they got off the phone. Did he know the Oberkirch operation, 8 miles east? Dairy, about 800 cows, TMR system. Their own hammer mill, he knew them by name. Not well. Call them, Loretta said. Their mill is running at maybe half capacity. I don't know what they'd want for custom grinding, but it's worth the conversation before you look anywhere else. Walt drove to the Oberkirch place 2 days later. Dan Oberkirch walked him through the feed bay without much preamble. The hammer mill was a 30-horsepower electric unit, not a farm shop machine, not a vintage PTO setup. It was industrial, purpose-built, running on 3-phase power. It processed grain 3 mornings a week for the dairy's TMR batches and sat idle every afternoon. Dan's first question was scheduling. His second was about screen size. He ran his dairy ration coarser than swine finishing required. Different screens, 40 minutes to change over, that time came out of Walt's afternoon window. They settled on a per-ton rate for custom grinding on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons. Walt would bring the corn, handle loading and unloading, work around the dairy's schedule. Cash, per load. The soybean meal was a separate problem. Walt called 3 feed dealers before he found one 40 miles west, still offering 15-day terms. 2 tons, retail pricing, net 15 float to manage against his cash position. Reorder every 3 weeks. The vitamin mineral premix came from a farm supply house an hour north. Non-negotiable, without trace minerals and fat-soluble vitamins at the right inclusion rate, the deficiency doesn't show up immediately. It shows up 6 weeks later in bone development and immune response, by which point you've compounded the problem across multiple production cycles. Loretta sent him a formulation sheet. Walt ran the ration on paper 3 times before he mixed the first batch. Corn, 74% by weight. Soybean meal, 22%. Mineral vitamin premix, 2.5%. Salt, 1.5%. He wrote those numbers in his notebook and circled them. The first weigh-in came at day 7. His tracking group, 30 ear-tagged head, was running average daily gain of 1.71 pounds. His benchmark on the commercial ration had been 1.85. He was 0.14 pounds below target. He ran the FCR 3.61. He'd given up 0.14 points of feed efficiency. That was inside the range Loretta had projected. The Oberkirch mill was doing its job. He did the cost math that Sunday evening. His self-formulated ration was running $41 per ton, below the tri-state price. At an FCR of 3.61, the per pound of gain cost was still below what he'd been paying. The math was holding. He wrote 3.61 in his notebook next to the date and the word acceptable. He should have stopped thinking about 3.47. He didn't stop thinking about it. I know that feeling precisely. When a system that worked perfectly has to be replaced by something less precise, there's a specific kind of unease that's not quite panic. It's closer to grief, a slow relinquishing of a standard you built carefully over years. Walt had spent 3 seasons narrowing his FCR down to 3.47. Now he was running at 3.61 and calling it acceptable. The number was still inside range. The operation was still profitable. But the distance between 3.47 and 3.61 represented real work he couldn't fully recover. I ran a comparable calculation in 1985 on my own operation. Different inputs, different crop. And I remember writing a number in my own notebook and telling myself the same word. Acceptable. That word has a way of closing off questions you should keep asking. The second weigh-in was day 14. Walt pulled the tracking group mid-morning. He weighed each animal, wrote the number down, calculated the average. He ran ADG for the interval, 63 pounds per day. He checked the arithmetic twice. Then he ran FCR, 3.78. He stood in the barn for a moment with the notebook open. 3.78 was not inside the range Loretta had projected. 3.78 was not acceptable. 378 was the kind of number that made the cost math stop working, where the per-ton savings no longer covered the efficiency penalty, where every day on feed was costing more than the commercial ration would have cost, where the decision to self-formulate was no longer clearly correct. He walked the pens. The hogs were eating. Feeders were cleaning. No obvious health issues, no animals off in the corners, no behavioral signals of a ration problem. They were eating normally and gaining slowly. That combination, high intake, low gain, had a meaning, and the meaning was that something in the feed was not converting. He called Loretta that afternoon. "Walk me through the last batch step by step," she said. He did. Corn delivery from Oberkirch Monday. Measured moisture at pickup. 14.2%, within normal range. Mixed Tuesday morning. Weighed each component on the hanging scale. Formulation numbers matched the sheet. Fed starting Tuesday noon. "Has anything changed at the mill?" she asked. "I don't know." "Call Oberkirch. Ask about the screens." He called Dan. The screens hadn't been changed since Walt started custom grinding, 5 weeks of use, processing both the dairy ration and Walt's corn. Dan hadn't checked where. Walt drove out Wednesday morning. The screen on a hammer mill is a perforated steel plate that surrounds the rotor and controls maximum particle size of the ground material. As the mill processes grain, the holes wear larger, gradually, not dramatically, but measurably. A screen rated at 3/32 of an inch perforations might drift to 4/32 after sustained use without inspection. The resulting grind is coarser, not so coarse that it's obvious to the eye. Coarse enough that digestive efficiency in a finishing hog drops. Walt had not checked screen wear when he arranged the custom grinding agreement. The first weigh-in at 3.61 had supported the assumption that the mill was producing consistent output. The second weigh-in at 3.78 was telling him the assumption had expired somewhere in the interval. Dan pulled the screen that morning and held it up to the light. You could see the difference without measuring. The holes had a slight elongation, the edges worn smooth rather than sharp-edged. He had a replacement. The changeover took 20 minutes, but Walt stood in that equipment bay while Dan worked, and the question he was turning over was not about the screen. The screen was fixable. The question was whether the entire structure he'd built, the extension agent, the custom grinding arrangement, the retail soybean meal, the formulation notebook, had been constructed on an assumption of control he didn't actually have. He had assumed he was managing the ration. He had been managing everything around the ration. The grind quality, the most critical variable in the performance equation, had been drifting outside his control for 2 weeks, while he watched his tracking numbers and wrote acceptable. What else was he not seeing? This is the moment I most want younger farmers to sit with. Not the screenware, that's a maintenance detail. The question Walt was asking himself in that equipment bay is one I wish I had asked myself a decade earlier. In 1979, I thought I was managing my farm. I was managing delivery schedules, lender relationships, and contract pricing. The foundational variables, soil biology, input chemistry, the actual mechanics of what was happening in the ground, I was observing but not understanding at the level I needed. When credit tightened in 1982, I didn't have enough working knowledge to adapt. I could only react. Walt was luckier than I was in one way. He called Loretta before he called a dealer. I did it backwards. I called the dealer first and spent 6 weeks trying to solve a knowledge problem with a purchasing decision. He drove home and pulled every data point from the previous 5 weeks. Corn moisture readings. Consistent, 13.8 to 14.5%. Not the problem. Soybean meal inclusion rate. He tested the hanging scale with a 50-pound calibration sack. It read 49.8 pounds. Not the problem. Vitamin mineral premix inclusion, 2.5% by weight, consistent across batches. Not the problem was the screen. One variable, wearing gradually, invisible without pulling the component. The kind of variable a commercial mill manages on a fixed maintenance schedule. The kind a custom grinding arrangement exposes you to if you don't build an inspection protocol from the start. He had not built one. He did now. The screen replacement changed the grind. Walt ran a handful of the first new batch through his fingers, and the difference was tactile, finer, more consistent. less of the coarser particles he'd noticed accumulating in the feeder bins over the previous week without fully registering what they meant. Day 21 on the new batch. A DG1, £69 per day. FCR 3, 71, better than 3, 78, not back to 3, 61. He stared at that number and called Loretta. She walked through the likely explanation. The hogs in the affected cohort had been on lower efficiency feed during the screenwear period. Animals in the finishing stage don't immediately recover after a suboptimal nutrition interval. The energy deficit from those 2 weeks would carry through the remainder of the cycle. The cohort behind them, the ones who had entered finishing after the screen replacement, would come in better. "How long until you see it?" Walt asked. "Next cycle, maybe 3 weeks. He wrote 3.71 in the notebook. Next to it, in smaller writing, screen replaced week 3, cohort lag. Day 28, 3, 64. Day 35, 3, 60. The clean cohort's first weigh-in, 3, 57, 3, 57. He wrote it down, the season-end calculation, done at the kitchen table in early June. Average FCR across the full self-formulated period, 3.64, pulled up by the screenwear cohort. Excluding that cohort, underlying system performance ran 3.57 to 3.60. Commercial tri-state ration, 1984, 3.47. The gap was 0.10 to 0.13 points. The Oberkirch mill on a maintained screen produced better particle size consistency than a typical on-farm setup, better than projected, worse than before. Self-formulated cost per hundredweight of gain, $41.20. Estimated commercial cost at 1984. Tri-state pricing, $43.80. Net advantage after FCR adjustment, $1.70 per hundredweight. On 580 head over a 60-day cycle at 240 pounds market weight. Roughly $590 per cycle. 2 cycles, just over $1,100 for the period. In a year when Walt's total net operating income came in at $17,400, that $1,100 was not a rounding error. There's a number that matters more than FCR, and Walt understood it by the time he closed his notebook on the 1985 season. 3. 47 was not a performance benchmark. It was a description of conditions. Conditions where grain was ground on calibrated industrial equipment to precise particle size targets, formulated by professional nutritionists with access to ingredient analysis, delivered on a schedule that removed supply chain management from the farmer's operational burden. 3. 47 was what efficiency looked like when the system around it was working. 3. 57 was what he could hold when the system had stopped. Those are different things. Not better and worse, different. One measures what you can achieve when conditions cooperate, the other measures what you can maintain when they don't. The screenware had nearly made that distinction academic. At 3.90 FCR on retail ingredient pricing, the cost math would have inverted. He would have been losing money per animal while believing he was saving it. The math almost broke him, not through bad luck, but through a technical variable he hadn't known to monitor because he'd never managed that piece of the system before. I've been thinking about why this particular story stays with me after 40 years. It's not the screen. It's not even the FCR. It's the notebook. Walt kept records in the good years when there was no crisis, not because anyone required it, but because he wanted to know the truth about what he was operating. When January came and the cooperative folded and he had 12 days of feed, the notebook was what he had to work from. The 3.47 was in there. Loretta asked for it and he gave it to her in 3 seconds. I started this channel because the people who did that work, who kept those notebooks, who maintained those standards when the incentive was to cut corners, most of them never wrote anything down about themselves. They wrote down FCR. They wrote down moisture. They wrote down screen inspection schedules. The institutional memory of how farming actually worked through the worst years of the 1980s is sitting in the notebooks of people who are in their 70s and 80s right now, and it's going to be gone when they are. That's why I'm here. In his notebook, at the bottom of the 1985 column, Walt wrote 2 lines. Commercial ration, tri-state, final year, FCR 3.47. Self-formulated, Oberkirch custom grind, year 1, FCR 3.57. Below those, one more line. Screen inspection, every 3 weeks. No reflection, no summary, just the number he'd earned, the number he'd held, and the maintenance item he'd missed the first time. He closed the notebook and went out to check the feeders. If the numbers behind these decisions, the variables that moved quietly until they didn't, are worth something to you, subscribe. Walt closed the notebook and went out to check the feeders. That's where the story ends. The numbers stay in the book.